The church now known as Dumbarton United Methodist Church was founded in a barrel maker's shop on Christmas Eve of 1772, which makes it one of the longest running continuous United Methodist congregations in the United States. We're celebrating our 250th anniversary this year. The Methodist Society in Georgetown was one of the stops along the Frederick Circuit, which stretched from Bladensburg, Maryland to Leesburg, Virginia. In 1772, Francis Asbury appointed Robert Strawbridge and Richard Owings to serve the Frederick Circuit. At that time, the community here in Georgetown was just a tobacco port along the Potomac River, but within 25 years, by the beginning of the 19th century, Georgetown had become prosperous and influential. It was part of a new federal city, Washington, D.C., and its Methodist Society grew from a small, obscure group into a church, Montgomery Street Methodist Church, that included some of the town's most prominent citizens, including Henry Foxhall, who was the mayor of Georgetown. Later generations of this congregation went on to help found 6 other congregations in Washington, D.C., including Capitol Hill, Foundry, and Eldbrook, Mount Zion. We also launched missions overseas, and in this congregation were some of the denomination's most outspoken supporters and opposition to the institution of slavery. It is impossible to tell the history of this church without talking about our nation and our denomination's complicated history with race and racism. In the early 19th century, some members of this congregation, the Montgomery Street Church, owned slaves. Others were part of abolition movements. There were a number of free African Americans who were part of the congregation as well. However, worship in this church was segregated. African Americans were forced to sit in the balcony and were not allowed to hold positions of leadership in the church. So in 1813, Black members of this congregation left to form Mount Zion, the oldest Black church in Washington. However, that church remained under white control by this congregation for many decades to follow. This church building was built in 1850. And during the Civil War, the sanctuary was converted into a hospital for soldiers who had been wounded at the Battle of Manassas in Virginia. President Lincoln attended the service to rededicate this sanctuary to a church after the war, and by all accounts was moved to tears by the sermon. But members of this congregation were divided over the Civil War and the institution of slavery, with people supporting both the Confederacy and the Union. A few blocks from here is the old Methodist burying ground, established in 1808. It is now called the Mount Zion and Female Union Band Cemetery. White and Black, enslaved and free members of Montgomery Street Church and later Mount Zion are buried there. During the time of slavery, it was also used as a stop along the Underground Railroad. In 1849, an all-white cemetery, Oak Hill, was built on an adjacent property, and the members of Montgomery Street stopped using the old Methodist burying grounds. In 1879, after years of declining use, Montgomery Street Church granted a 90-year lease to Mount Zion of the cemetery. And in 2006, an independent 501c3 nonprofit was founded to oversee the preservation and restoration of the cemetery and the legacy of the persons who are buried there. This year, as part of our 250th anniversary celebration, we are working with the Alliance for New Music Theater to sponsor a new musical libretto, which will tell the stories of some of the people who are buried in that cemetery. In 2015, on Mount Zion's 200th anniversary, Dumbarton issued an official apology to the congregation for our participation in acts of racism and discrimination. For several decades, our two churches have been engaged in ministry together, feeding our unhoused neighbors and worshiping together a few times a year. The other significant contribution that Dumbarton has made to Methodism is our long-standing witness for the full inclusion of LGBTQ+ people in the life of the church and fighting for their civil rights. Dumbarton became a reconciling congregation in 1987, which means that we celebrate 35 years of reconciling this year. We have stood on the side of love, affirming marriage equality and same-gender marriage even before it was legal in Washington, D.C. and in the United States. Members of Dumbarton have served in leadership on a number of the LGBTQ advocacy organizations within the denomination and have participated in general conference delegations and demonstrations over the last 40 years. The 40 years that our denomination has debated policies around human sexuality. In 2020, Dumbarton joined with a number of congregations in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, pledging to become an anti-racist church. And we adopted a new reconciling statement that recognizes the intersectional work of anti-racism and LGBTQ equality. We have been engaged in acts of reflection and action around anti-racism, honestly reckoning with our history and finding practical ways to make reparations. And we are committed to being part of the ongoing racial and economic justice work in our city and in our church.